On this blue collar coder, we are going to take a look at state management in Webpack 5 module federation apps. It's a little tangential, but it's super cool stuff. I'm Jack Herrington, a principal full stack engineer, and I just released Practical Module Federation 2.0, which is a huge upgrade on a book that I released almost 2 years ago now on this really cool topic of module federation in Webpack 5. So what is module federation? Well, it's a way to runtime share code between applications. So we're all familiar with build time dependencies like npm. This gives you the ability to do a runtime dependency, meaning that if you have a header that is shared from one application to another, when that application that has the header updates, the other application gets the change immediately at runtime, which is really cool when you need it. There are some risks, but it's really cool stuff. All right, so what we're going to do in this one is we're going to take a look at how to share state between the micro-frontends that you share between two applications. And we're going to take a look at 4 different models there. We're going to take a look at prop drilling, useContext, Zustand, and also Redux. Let's jump right into it. Okay, so I have this directory called state management, and into there I'm going to create a new directory called simple, and this is where we're going to do our prop drilling one. So I'm going to create 2 applications in here. We're going to create one called host. That's going to host a header that is created from another application called nav. Okay, so to create these applications, I am going to use create mf app. That is a utility that I wrote that allows you to very easily create test applications to build out a module federation framework. So we have a host application here. We're going to build that called host. It's going to be an type of application. It's going to be on port 3000, and we're going to use React for that. You can select from a whole bevy of different frameworks. I'm going to use JavaScript for this and Tailwind. And then I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to do create mf app, and I'm going to create another one called nav application on port 3001 this time. Again, React, JavaScript, and Tailwind. And let's bring up VS Code and see what we got. All right, we got these 2 directories. Let's go and create 2 shells. And in that first shell, I will go into the host directory and then do yarn and yarn start. And in the other one, I will go into nav and then do yarn and yarn start from there. And we'll see our awesome, beautiful applications. All right, so we've got the host application on port 3000 with the name host, framework React. Basically just gives you all of the selections that you made when you did create mf app. And the same thing for nav, except the difference in this point is just the name of the app. So what we want to do is we want to go build a header over in nav. And we want to share that over into the host application. So why do we want to do that? Well, we don't want to go and build that header in both locations. We want to be able to reuse that, but we want to reuse that in a way that's a runtime dependency and not a build time dependency, because when we want to update the nav, we want to make sure that it updates everywhere simultaneously. So let's go into a source directory. We'll make a header.jsx file. And in there, I'm going to import React. And I'm just going to export a default function. Very simple stuff. We'll have a header. I've got a class name in there. Let's do a div with header in there. Finish up our header, and we have Tailwind at our fingertips. So let's do a little bit of that. Let's do BG, maybe blue, 700, a text of white, a font of bold, a fairly large font, and maybe a little padding on there. And we'll set up with a flexbox because we'll be using that later. Okay, cool. So reasonable header. Let's actually go and use this in our own app first. So I'm just going to import that here. Import header from our local header. And then just use it. See how it looks. See if it's a nice header. So I'll put that at the top of the page here. And get rid of some of this stuff down here. We just need to know that this is the nav app. All right. And I'll move this CSS down there. Just rearrange it nicely. And yeah, okay. Looks pretty good. I like it. Okay, so we got our header in there, and we got the name of our app, which in this case is the nav app. So we've done our header, and now the host folks are like, hey, we want to use your header. We don't want to write our own thing. So can we use it, but can we use it at runtime? Heck yes, you can. You can go over here to your Webpack config in the nav app, and I'm going to expose the header. So we'll jump down here to our module federation plugin configuration, is an exposes key, and that lists the different modules that you want to expose. And so what I'll do is I'll just add in header, and I'll point it at source header. Now, the only thing I need to do at this point is reboot the Webpack 5 configuration. So I'm going to do that. So it looks like it's working, but it's also added behind the scenes this remote entry.js file. And remote entry.js is a manifest of all of the modules that are exposed by the nav app in this case. So until you expose something, you don't actually get a remote entry. Now that we've exposed something, we get the remote entry. So I'm just going to copy that and then back up, and we'll take a look at our nice nav. And I'm going to go now and concentrate over on the host app, because the host app was like, hey, we want to go and use this. So we'll go to our Webpack config, and then we'll scroll down. We'll go over here to remotes, and we'll do nav, and then we'll give it the name of the federated module, in this case, which is nav. And we'll say at, and then we'll give it that localhost connection. So where does that nav come from? Well, that nav comes from the Webpack config over here, this name right there. So these two have to match. This nav here has to match this nav right here. Other than that, you can name this whatever you want, but this one has to match. All right, so now we've got that included. Let's go over here into our source app, and then again, I'm going to import the header. But this time I'm going to import it from the nav header, and I'm going to drop that in here at the top, just like we did before. Get rid of these, and maybe take a little margin out of the top there. Make it a little bit distinguishing. And the only thing I need to do now is just restart our app, our host app. And there we go. Now we've got a header in our host app. And you can see that it is a live connection, because if I go over here to source header, I can say awesome header, hit save. That's now going to refresh nav. But it also, if I hit refresh on host, now I get the runtime update. That's really cool. I haven't done any NPM linking or any kind of mono rebuild work here. This is literally just a runtime connection between these two things. Awesome. Okay, so now we get to the point where we want to actually share some state. So we have some state in this host application. We're going to do an e-commerce app, so we're going to have a count of items in the cart. And we want to manage that count of items in the app itself, but we also want to show the count of items in the header up here. So the first thing we need to do is put it on the host page itself. So here we are on our app.jsx. And I'm just going to go and get some use state, and we're going to do some prop drilling, because that's the easiest way to share a state. And it's a good fundamental place to start. So I will make this a returnable function, and I will go and create a count and a set count from useState. And we'll just start off with 0, as you do. And I'll just put in here the count of items. Count is count. Cool. And a div there. Before you fill out my comment section with what is hinting all this stuff, this is GitHub Copilot that is helping me along the way. So I'm going to put in here add to cart. And our on click here is going to just add one to the cart, right? Pretty simple stuff. So set count to count plus 1. And let me give myself a little bit of a class name here, make it look pretty. So let's see, background again, I don't know, indigo. That's a slightly different blue, I guess. Text white, that's actually, I can't believe it actually hinted me all the Tailwind stuff. Oh, wow, that is actually really nice. Okay, so if I hit add to cart here, wouldn't you know it, we get a count plus 1. All right, so now we want to go and show this in a header. So what's the easiest way to do that? Well, the easiest way to do that would just be to send that count to that header. So let's do that. Let's do count equals count over here, and then on clear, because we wanted to be able to clear the cart in from the header. We're going to just give it a function where it just sets that count to 0. So we're going to have increment, and we're going to have clear. Increment adds 1 to the cart, and clear clears the cart. So that's basically, we have 2 functions on our one piece of state, which is the cart count. So now that we have that, let's go back over to our header. So over here in header, we're going to have count, and then we're going to have on clear. And I'm going to go and put count into this div. I'm going to go and do a little flex grow here thing. That's going to push this count over to the edge. And let's go make a button in there too. And that button is going to do that clear when I click it, or on clear. And it's going to have, oh, look at that. Nice. Okay. So we'll take that. All right. Looking good. Number is fine. Clear is fine, but I forgot to add some text. So let's go and do that. Let's clear cart. Nice. Okay. So I add it, clear it. Okay. So obviously this works. Prompt drilling, of course, works. But it's not really going to scale all that well. So what we really want to do instead is use context. So what we're going to do is actually take this example and retool it so that it is a use context-based example. But I'm going to retain this one and all of the examples so that you have them in the GitHub repo. So let me go and shut those down. And then I'll shut down VS Code and go back to my terminal. And I'm going to go back up a directory. And then I'm going to do npx npkill because I don't want to clone those node modules. And I'm going to get rid of those two sets of node modules. npx npkill is awesome, by the way. If you come away with one thing from this video, it's that npx npkill is the bomb. All right, let's do copy-r, and we'll take simple, and we'll make a new copy of it, and we'll call that useContext. So this is going to be our useContext example. And again, I'll run VS Code on that. All right, now let me bring up the terminal again, and I want to bring up two terminals. And in that first one, I'm going to go into that host directory and then do yarn. And that second one, I'm going to go into the nav directory and again do yarn. Now we're going to start on the host side of things. The host is going to maintain the context, the store. And it's actually going to give that off to the nav. So let's start over here in our host. And I'm going to go create a new file in here called the store. And I'll make it a JSX file. And I'm going to import React, as well as create context and use context from React. And then I'm going to go and create some context. So we'll call this count context. And I'll use create context on that. And I will set the initial state there to be essentially what will come out of a use state. So that can be 0 and then a function to do the setting. But in this case, it's just empty. It's not going to do anything. And now I need to create a provider component that's going to allow the consuming application, in this case, the host, to provide the count down to the different components. So let's go and export a function called count provider. And it's going to take children. And it's going to return the count context provider, wrapping those children. And in here, I'm just going to use useState and give it 0 to start with. And that's going to basically have that state that's going to go and replace this default value here of the create context. So now we've got our provider, and we just need a way to go and get to it. So I'm going to create a useCount custom hook that is going to use that context. So let's go and export a function called useCount. And it's just going to return a use context of the count context. Easy peasy. All right, let's give this a try in the app first and then see how it plays. So we'll bring in count provider over here in the app, as well as use count from our local store. So now I need to use that count provider, but I'm going to put it down here because you can't use the context in the same component as you provide it. So wrap that. And then in here, we can use useCount. And we're basically getting exactly the same thing as we did before with the count and the set count. All right, let's take a look and see how it rolls. So I'm going to yarn start both of these applications. All right, so it looks to be working just fine. And the nav seems to be working just fine as well. That's really good. So what we want to do now is, instead of prop drilling that stuff down to the header, we want to use the context for that. So let's go and expose the store so that nav can consume it. So let's go back over here to our Webpack config in host. And expose out that store. So let's see, store is going to be from source store. Cool. And now let's reboot the host. Looks good. And it does have a remote entry. Yes, it does, because now it's exposing something. So it has that manifest of things that it exposes, which includes the store and nothing else really. So let's go here to nav, and I'm going to go into its webpack config, scroll down, and I'm going to go here and I'm going to add in host, where it's host at that road entry. But I'm actually going to also do the same thing back over in host. And I'll show you why pretty soon. So now I've got that. And now over in nav, I'm going to go into the header. So I'm going to import from the host that use count, because that's going to have our data in it. So use count from host store. And now let's use that. We'll return out this code. And I want to get the count and the set count from that use count. I'm not going to get it from my props anymore. And we no longer have clear, so I'm just going to make that by creating a new function that's just going to set the count to 0. All right, that looks pretty good. Now, the only thing I would also need to do is just to make sure that the app itself works, I need to go and do a provider over here in app. So I'm going to go and bring that in as well. And I'll call that count provider. And I'll just wrap the header in that count provider. So now let's go and reboot nav. And now if I hit add to cart, nothing happens. Well, okay, so here's what's happening. So we're not actually sharing the same instance. So what I need to do is go back over here to our host app and go into that webpack config. And now I've got host in there. So in here in the app, I want to, instead of doing it from just ./store, I want to do it from host/store. And that's going to make sure that we're using exactly the same instance of that module in Webpack land. So let's Control C here. Let's restart the app. Now I do add to cart, and it works just fine. But now, oh, do I really know? Because we're passing in that count and that unclear. Let's get rid of that. And yep, works just fine. So now everything is working through context. So just to kind of step back for a second, let's go kind of diagram this out. So close out these. I'll create a new file called architecture.do. And this is a draw.io integration into VS Code. It's really, really handy. So we have the host app, and then we have the nav app, right? And then we've got our header, which we'll make kind of small. And I'm going to put the text on these up at the top. And so inside of nav is header, and then host over here looks at this header. So that was the state before, but now we've got this store. And now we've got this connection between nav and store, just like that. So this bidirectionality is really something unique that Module Federation allows you to do. So now let's try this one more time, and this time we're going to use Zustand. So I want to be able to share a state without doing context. So let's take a look at that use case. So in this case, we don't have to have a provider at the top of the tree. We're just going to have a custom hook that you can then use and use anywhere. So let's try that out first. And that involves going back to our terminal. And again, I'm going to do that npx, npkill, and delete the no modules because they're kind of slow to get. And I'm going to create a new directory called Zustand. And I'm going to jump in there. So Zustand is a very lightweight state manager that is kind of similar in feel to a Redux, but just not as heavyweight and not as boilerplatey. All right, so again, I'll bring up the terminal and we'll create 2 terminals. And here I'm going to go into host again and then do yarn. And then in here, I'm going to go into nav and then do yarn. Now back in host, I'm going to add Zustand. And I'm going to change that store file to be implemented using Zustand and not using the context. So let's just get rid of all of that. And Zustand has a create function. So I'm going to grab that. So I'll call this one use store. And I'll use create. And create takes a function And one of the parameters of that function is the set function that you use to set the store. But what we want to do first is start off with a value. So that'd be count. And so we'll set that to 0 to start. And then we want two functions on here. We want the increment function, which is going to take the current count and just add 1 to it. And then we want a clear function that's just going to set the count to 0. And then we want to export that as the default. And that's it. That's Zustand. That is what you need to do to build a store in Zustand. How cool is that? That is awesome. Okay, so let's go over here to our app. And I'm just going to import useStore from store. And I'm going to replace our use count with that. And that's going to give us back an object from which we destructure count and also increment in this case, because we want to be able to increment a value. So we drop that in there for increment. And we no longer need a provider. So that's a much nicer feel to our shared state management system. And then let's go over here to our header and do the same thing. So we got use count over here. I'm just going to get rid of that and use useStore instead. And again, we need that count, so we'll take that. But in this case, we need clear from there as well, because that's the functionality that we're looking for in the header. And we just do it on the on-click. Nice. And we don't need the provider anymore, so we can get rid of that from the app. Look how easy this is. Cleaning stuff up left and right. All right, here we go. So what we want to do is now over in the nav app, we want to do yarn start. And then over in the host app, we want to do the same thing. Now let's take a look to see if we're working or not. I'm going to hit refresh. And there it is, working just like that. And that's the beauty of Zustand, right? So you get an amazingly small store file, right? So we just are creating a hook here. You don't need to use context or any of that. So the API surface is much more compact than you have with context, and certainly with something like Redux, which we're going to take a look at next. But the salient thing here is that we're not actually changing out this architecture in any way. So is this the right architecture though, right? We got this kind of bidirectionality going on here. What would be really, really nice is if we could have that store over here, maybe in another app, say a store app, like that. And then we could just point to that from both applications. So can we get there? Heck yeah, we can. And we'll do it with Redux so that you can also get a chance to see how Redux works in this context as well, because I know a lot of people work with Redux, so I want to be able to give you that knowledge as well. All right, so one last time, we're going to close out our VS Code, go back into our directory, again, do our npx npkill, get rid of those files. And this time I'm actually going to start with useContext. And I'm going to create our Redux directory. All right, so why did I use useContext as a starting point? Well, I wanted to make sure that we had kind of a clear starting point. So now I want to go and actually add a third application. So I'm going to need 3 terminals as opposed to 1. So let's go and add one more and one more. And in that first one, I'm going to go into the host directory and do yarn. In that second one, I'm going to go into the nav directory and then do yarn. And then this third one, we are going to reuse that npx create mf app. And we're going to call this one store. So there's going to be a third app. It's going to be called store, type of application on port 3002 in React, in JavaScript, using Tailwind. It doesn't matter. This is not actually going to be a UI visible project. And I'm going to go into that store and then do yarn. And then I'm going to add Redux toolkit. So I'm going to use the toolkit for that. And I'm going to use React Redux. So now let's go into our store and we'll create the store within the store application. So I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be called store.jsx. And I don't know all this stuff by heart, so I'm going to use the quick start from the Redux toolkit. All of that, of course, is linked to in the description down below. And we'll just start off with this starting point here to configure the store. Looks like a good place to start. So now I need a slice, which is a Redux thing. And it's got some, okay, so it's got a value here. We'll call that count. In fact, actually, let's take this initial state. Let's kind of clean this up as we go. We'll do an initial state, and we'll do count in there as our initial state. We want a clear. We don't want an increment by value. Don't need that. And this is going to be state.count. And this is going to be state.count. And in the case of a clear, we'll just set it to 0. All right, that looks good. So we got our actions that were created. Let's do that as increment and clear. We have a reducer down here. And what we want to do is pass that to the reducer like so. We'll call that counter. And we'll get rid of that. But now we don't want to have everybody kind of interact with it like you would Redux, right? Let's go and kind of hide the Redux element of this and just have a provider, which we know we're going to need. And then we'll give ourselves a new custom hook called like useStore, which would have the count and then increment as a function and then also clear as a function and kind of hide the Reduxy element of this. So the first thing we need to do is come back here and let's do a little bit of cleanup. And then I'm going to import React because we're going to be building our provider first. And let's take a look. We also need the provider from React Redux like that. Cool. Let's bring that in there. And we'll call this one export function store provider. And it's going to take children and it's going to return a provider, a Redux provider, with the store as the store and then the children in it. That looks pretty good. Okay, cool. And then we'll also export a function called useStore. And what it needs to do is then use selector and use dispatch. So let's first get the count using the use selector. And then let's add an increment function, which does a dispatch of increment. Now we got get dispatch, so let's go and get that. Dispatch equals use dispatch. Okay, pretty cool. And then clear, let's do use clear like that. So I think we got a good store going on here. So the next thing we need to do is go back over to our Webpack config, and we gotta expose that. So let's do a store is source store, nice. And let's fire it up, see how it goes. So you do yarn start on the store. Looks like it's working. We have a remote entry on there, do we? We do. That's a good sign. So let's go back over here to our Webpack configs of a host first. And let's go bring that in. So we don't need host anymore. We just need store because we're going to use the centralized one. And the same thing with our nav. So now both of these applications are pointing back to the same store, which is great. Now let's go into the app and see what we got. So we got store provider and use store from the store. And we'll change out count provider there with the new store provider. And let's see. So use store is going to have count and increment. And let's call increment to dispatch that action to the Redux store. Now let's go and see if we need to make changes to nav, which we do. So again, we're going to need store, and it's going to be use store. Let's see, we need count and clear. Let's do the clear in here. Awesome. And I think the last thing we would need would be over here in app. We need to get the provider. So that'd be the store provider from store. And let's save that out. Let's see where we go. I have a feeling that this might work. I hope. Yarn start. I have faith. Okay, so let's do yarn start over in host and see how we go. All right, host is booting. That's always a good sign. Let's add a cart. Hey, very cool. Awesome. Does nav work? Yes, nav works as well. That's great. So let's take a look at the architecture of this and see what we have wrought. Let's go down here to our architecture.diagram and show you how this is actually all working and fitting together. So now we've got a new app called Store. It has within it a store. And then this host app also talks to that store. All right, so that's looking pretty clean. And what this allows is it will just allow for multiple hosts. For example, I would have for example, a PDP host in here, and that would connect to the store. I might have a checkout host here. But the nice thing here is you don't have everybody kind of routing everything back to that one store that's located in the host. The store is in its own module, as you would if you did something like an NPM or a monorepo setup. All right, well, I hope this gives you some architectural options when you think about how to use module federation and how to solve one of the biggest issues around module federation, which is where to put that state and how to manage that. You've gotten a bunch of different options in this video. You've gotten the prop drilling option, got useContext, Zustand, and Redux. And not only that, but how to have the store located in one app versus in a centralized app. So a lot of different options for you when it comes to architectural solutions in the module federation space. Of course, if you like this video, be sure to hit that like button. If you really like the video, hit the subscribe button and click on that bell and be notified the next time a new one of these videos comes out. But in the meantime, you might want to check out the Practical Module Federation book, now in its 2.0 form. Really exciting. I've got a link to that in the description down below. Click on that. Buy yourself a copy for a Christmas present or a holiday present. Enjoy.